Brilliant. So yes, I think we are really in a turning point for higher education. There is a real crisis. I don't think the model was before sustainable because it was based on student fees and in particular international student fees, and there is a growing competition from various countries. But of course, with the pandemic, the need for an economic recovery, Brexit, and its uncertain effects, we can see that we need to think about what is the higher education of the future. And I think that here in the North, we do have an opportunity to really think about it and think, what do we want for higher education? So that is part of the background, of course. The other background, the other part of that is that Queen's senior management is launching a new 10-year strategic plan. And of course, John and I remember the last one because we were already here, which led 20% of the academic staff to leave. And of course, when academics leave, they leave with their team, their material, their grant, their output, their books, their reputation, and so on. We never really recover from this. So it is important what kind of plan do we have. It is important that we deal with the brain drain in the region, that we address significant sector-wide and Northern Ireland issues. So the other thing also that we really wanted is this time having a genuine buy-in from staff, students, but also stakeholders in the community about what Queen's should be in the future. So this was prompted really also with Queen's consulting document. They asked different consultants to do some assessment prior to designing their own strategy. And we had issues with those documents because, well, first it was same old, same old. Let's cut small programs and the diversity of the curriculum. Let's have more flexible work. Perhaps you don't know this, but in the UK, we think that 60%, 2/3 of academics are already on casual contracts. We didn't see how that would be, an improvement or a change or something innovative. We also thought that the consultancy on the table were really focused on a very narrow categories of stakeholders and very much connected to business. It's important, but of course, businesses are going to tell you that they need graduates who are tailored to what they need. But of course, business needs, the economic needs are changing all the time. And this is how we started to have a group of staff and students working together. We have done an alternative or a minority report with 30 individuals that we have interviewed from a much wider cross-section of the society here. And we also launched another initiative. We're sourcing ideas from the crowd, and I think John will touch upon that at the end. So here is just the type of people that we have interviewed. It was in October and November. You will find in your pack a much more developed presentation of this minority report with lots of quotes and themes that were touched upon by our stakeholders. But these are the key findings. There is an immense respect for Queen's among our stakeholders and high expectations in terms of intellectual leadership, innovation and education. So it really has a critical role, but at the same time, there was also the feeling among our respondents that it was missing this opportunity for different reasons. The first one is that it doesn't really connect well with the local community, and especially those who are the most deprived as well. Whoever you are in the society, there's this idea that it struggles with diversity and inclusion. And we can talk about that after in the discussion, that it really misses the opportunity to create, co-create, engage, to disseminate and share knowledge. It applies here a model of higher education that is hegemonic in England, but not very suited for Northern Ireland. And we can speak about this afterwards, of course. And so it doesn't really play the great role it could play as an economic anchor, as having a civic role also in debates and political discussions. And I think these are things that Ian Greer, the vice chancellor, and Joe, we agreed on when we presented this report to them. We had a very interesting reflection, and I think we converge on many of those points. So here are a few quotes. You can see, the idea that Queen is Victorian is a bit fossilized. It came very often. The fact that Queens struggles to find its identity in a very changing society, in a very changing university intake, that it doesn't really fit with its social environment. Very often we had stakeholders mentioning how actually focusing on bringing overseas students was done at the detriment of the local children and the local students, especially those who can't really afford an education. And the question was really the balance to be struck between, of course, what is economically necessary for the institution, but also preserving, enhancing its role to advance knowledge, share, and advance ideas, especially in social sciences, humanity, and arts. So what's needed, according to our stakeholders, more emphasis on job and employment for local communities that makes sense for our region. Teaching and research that could involve more outreach, engage more with the community, widening participation, of course, diversifying the curriculum rather than reducing its diversity, promoting intellectual freedom and creativity, having this civic role, really, this being a forum of ideas, and of course, making the university more inclusive. So here are the potential strategic priorities. Queens could be a living lab. It could be a civic anchor institution. Teaching and research could be and should be supported to include and be more embedded with its social environment. And of course, we're here also to say that involving staff and students in the strategic development is also key for a better plan. And now I'm going to move the slides and let John further for his section.
That's great. Thank you, Veronique. Just to reiterate, the motivation behind us as members of staff who voluntarily undertaken this stakeholder analysis was partly to do with a sense that the existing stakeholder analysis that senior management had done was essentially rich alumni and businesses. And while they're important, it just leaves out a whole swathe of particularly local vested interest and stakeholders. So that's why we, in our view, did a more comprehensive analysis of getting feedback from essentially the communities that we should be serving. And part of this then led to what I'm proposing here of the university delivering on its social charter, which we've had now for the last number of years, and becoming an anchor institution. And for those of you who are interested in this, and I know Minister Hargy and her team are interested in the idea of community wealth building, which has been developed in Preston with the University of Central Lancashire. It's also in Drexel University in Philadelphia. It's essentially what's called EDS and MEDS. It's essentially how can publicly funded education institutions and the fact that the Belfast Social and Social Care Trust is the largest trust in the UK, alongside Belfast Met, Belfast City Council itself, University of Ulster. There you have major local anchor institutions with large public procurement budgets, the capacity to relocalize and create a much more resilient local economy. So there's a lot more to it than that, but it really is about seeing that there's a lot more universities, but also other publicly funded institutions. Particularly, as I say, it's a remarkable and under acknowledged aspect that the Belfast Social Health and Care Trust is the largest in the UK. I mean, I had a student do an analysis last year of looking at the public sector institutions. And again, we didn't have the detail to go in, but it's over £1 billion in procurement in these institutions. Are we getting the best value for money? So it's about how can we use these local anchor institutions, perhaps a partnership between the likes of Queen's, Ulster University and the City Council to get what's happening now in Birmingham, which is a memorandum of understanding amongst the various anchor institutions in that city to basically, in the context of the pandemic, we are facing a joblessness crisis. And what we need as we come out of this is a jobs-led recovery. You'd like to think that we're not going to go back to the same kind of competitiveness, growth-orientated model, and we really do need to start growing local jobs. And that's where I think it's about, well, yourselves as the committee and as the appropriate elected officials overseeing our higher education institutions, what else should you be demanding of the university to consider, without of course interfering in freedom of expression and intellectual curiosity and so on. But certainly for us as members of staff, it's about delivering on that civic duty, particularly in the context of this crisis, which we're going to need more jobs. I actually also think, just to reiterate what Veronique was saying, that now in the context of the pandemic is the time to reflect and reset a lot of things that's going on in terms of our society. So it's a good time to relook and to look at the context of higher education and what it should be delivering in the decades ahead, but also in the context of the pandemic. So next slide, please, Veronique. Like a lot of public sector institutions, actually also in the corporate world as well, and I'm sure it hasn't gone unremarked by yourselves on the committee, the UN SDGs, or the Sustainable Development Goals, are going to become an increasingly important part of the strategic direction of many organisations. There are 17 with over 200 indicators. I'm not going to bore you with that. But what I'd like to point out is that many of these objectives that we'd all agree with in terms of poverty reduction, peace and, strong democratic institutions can be connected in a way to issues around, for example, the climate challenge. And as New Decade, New Approach quite rightly, indicated, we do need to see that Northern Ireland needs to play its part, not least in terms of, removing its status as the only part of these islands that doesn't have its own dedicated climate change legislation. But particularly in terms of our stakeholder analysis, this idea of a just transition, which again is in New Decade, New Approach, I think can be connected and should be connected with the UN SDGs and particularly what the university is doing. And the good news is this is where our kind of independent stakeholder analysis overlapped with what senior management had already done. It's very clear that for the decade ahead, Queen's University will be making the SDGs a core part of what we do in terms of teaching, research, outreach, engagement, and indeed our on-site campus activities. And we think this is a slightly, different perspective we would have as members of staff on this issue, that we should be more embedded locally and using, as Veronique said, our local communities as the living lab to produce international, expert and, excellent knowledge, as opposed to what's often seen as the direction of travel for many higher education institutions, which has been international, and it's almost like they're disembedded from their local communities. So for us, it's a plea for relocalization, for seeing, for example, that Northern Ireland and Queens in particular has a lot of expertise in conflict resolution and conflict transformation. And this is going to be a major part of what we're going to have to deal with as we embed the SDGs, because there's going to be winners and losers. If you're, somebody who works in Kilroot Power Station, it's clear that while we move to gas, which is better than oil, eventually we're going to have to move beyond gas. So how are we going to deal with those displaced workers? What about those low-income families who have to make a choice between heat or eat in terms of, if renewable electricity is more expensive? So our view is that how can we bring together the expertise of Queen's on these issues around conflict transformation, which are going to be really, really important to bring our communities along in terms of decarbonisation and the transition to a climate resilient future society. Next slide, please, Veronique. Now, an example, and this is the impact of the pandemic in terms of the analysis that we were able to do. The university has saved a lot of money, like a lot of organisations, in terms of massive reductions in international air travel. And again, like a lot of other institutions, I don't think we should go back to normal. My own view is that the pandemic has cancelled the future, but that's okay. It was a pretty bad one anyway. It was full of inequality and, growing ecological damage. Now is the time to actually build back better. That's the whole point of our presentation. Here's one example of how the lessons of the pandemic, of how can we do our core work save money, reduce our carbon emissions. And it's something that we feel strongly as members of staff, that it's performatively contradictory for us as intellectuals and academics to be flying around the world to do a half-an-hour presentation. Don't get me wrong, there are times when international travel is absolutely required and so on. But again, it's that issue of how do we rethink our core operations in a way where we're living our values. You know, what I'm trying to say is that we can't, as a university, embrace the university outside of the Sustainable Development Goals and then continue with business as usual in terms of our international flights and so on. And that's something that I think the university is listening to. It would certainly be helpful for the committee to reflect upon this and perhaps, you know, have some comment on it as well. Next slide, please. So I'll just do them all, Veronique, rather than go through them each at a time. Just to sum up, this is what we see as part of this co-creation of solutions. We're not here with all the solutions, but we're here to offer some ideas of people who are at the coalface, to use an inappropriate term, given the need to decarbonise. But we see these 4 key areas as issues to focus upon. What we're doing on campus. It would be great, for example, if Queen's was to be a living wage employer. It currently isn't. This reflects the precarious nature of a lot of you know, staff at the university. We also think that no student at the university should come out with a degree without some knowledge of the greatest challenge our species has ever faced in terms of the planetary emergency. So we are, as members of staff, working with management on developing, you know, core modules that every student who graduates in the years ahead will be able to come out with some knowledge of how to deal with these issues. What are the opportunities and challenges of decarbonisation, of ecological sustainability? We absolutely think that we need to move much more to interdisciplinary research, or what I call intellectually promiscuous research, and that is a challenge given the disciplinary nature of the institution, but we are certainly working on that. And particularly the last point is a particular passion and interest of mine. How can we really deliver on being a civic institution, become an anchor, a good friend and neighbour, begin to address, you know, long-standing issues like the Holy Lands, which every year, you know, comes up as an issue, and indeed it was reflected in our stakeholder analysis. I'm not saying we have the solutions, but I do think we need to find new ways of working and helping our local communities. And I do think we do need to start building back better. You know, what are the job opportunities, the training needed for the next generation of workers in terms of the inevitable transition to a decarbonised economy? And I'll leave it there.
So that is our.
Right. Go on ahead, Veronica.
Just wanted to comment. The last, this last slide is this crowdsourcing initiative that we started. All of you